My name is Bob Newton. I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I'm special assistant to Father Leahy, the president of Boston College. And I'd like to welcome you all to this event this evening. I'm sure it will be both illuminating and interesting. This year, and I'm sure probably all of you have seen C21 Resources, which has in the very center something called C21 Update, which has all of our programs for this semester. We're working hard on a parallel volume for the second semester. This one was focused on grace and commitment, the vocations of the laity, and the next semester, edited by Father Richard Lennon, who is here at the School of Theology and Ministry, will be on the same theme, grace and commitment, the vocations of the ordained and the religious. The Church in the 21st Century was founded in 2002 by Father Leahy as the Boston College's response to the clerical sexual abuse crisis in the Church. And its goal, its mission is to be a resource and a catalyst for the renewal of the Church. And we don't focus on everything that the Church should be interested in, but we focus on four things. We focus on the roles and relationships of within the Church. We focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition. We focus on the handing on the faith mostly to the next generation, and we focus on sexuality in the Catholic tradition. I think tonight's event probably coincides most with our effort to address the concept of handing on the faith, and I'm sure will be a very rich presentation of how the faith was handed on in other ages where people were not perhaps as literate or didn't all have some sort of device in their pocket where they could text while driving to hear this lecture. The campus police will arrest you too, so don't try it on campus. But my role is just to tell you a little bit about the Church in the 21st century, and I'm going to introduce our terrific assistant director who, as interim director, I can say runs the center, to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Karen Kelly. Karen Kelly Kiefer.
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'm really pleased and honored to have Professor Anatolios speak tonight. The last time he participated in a C21 event was March 9th, I think, of 2009. And I remember it well because he spoke on the Jesus Prayer. And you know, it's funny, we all take time to come to these events or these lectures, and you never really know what kind of effect they have on your life or in your studies or in your parish. And at the time of Khaled's presentation, I had a daughter who was very sick, and no one knew what was wrong with her, and we were seeing a lot of doctors. But anyway, he really inspired me to do the Jesus Prayer with her every night. So since March of 2009, every night before she goes to bed, she does the Jesus Prayer. And now she's getting better and she's back at school. And so anyway, among Khaled's many gifts, he continues to inspire and share the gift of faith. Tonight's presentation probably shedding more gifts and spreading more of his knowledge. Let me tell you a little bit about this dynamic man. He is the director of the STD program here at the School of Theology and Ministry. He is also an associate professor of historical theology. He holds a BA and MA degrees from the University of Toronto, and a PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. He's written several books. The bookstore is here tonight selling one of his books. He's on the steering committee of the Boston Colloquial of Historical Theology and a member of the board of directors of the Papist Patristic Institute at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. Say that quickly 2 times. Khalid was born of Egyptian parents and India, and he also grew up in Egypt and in Canada. He is married to his lovely wife Meredith, and when he's not studying the early church fathers, he is the father of 4 children. Khalid, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that very nice introduction, that wonderfully inspiring witness of your own faith and prayer. There's a wonderful story by Flannery O'Connor that some of you might be familiar with called Parker's Back. People read that story? It traces a fairly typical pattern in Flannery O'Connor's stories in which a character who seems to be spiritually vapid is violently visited by divine grace. In this case, the main character is O.E. Parker, who is very reticent to disclose that his initials stand for the biblical names Obadiah Elihu. As the story opens, Parker is perplexed and despondent to find himself married to a very plain and rigidly pious woman, Sarah Ruth, whom he apparently never found in any way attractive. The best sense he can make of how he ended up being married to her is that she would not let him sleep with her otherwise, though he also has an uncomfortable sense that he was compelled by mysterious forces he doesn't quite understand. Before meeting Sarah Ruth, the one thing that lifted Parker's existence from utter vacuity was an obsession with tattoos. Since the age of 14, when he saw a man in a fair tattooed from head to foot, he had been drawn by an irresistible attraction from time to time to inscribe his own flesh with one tattoo after another until he reached the point when only his back was tattoo-free. Parker is estranged from his wife's piety, just as he considers her in general to be incomprehensible and depressingly unattractive. But then he suffers an apocalyptic moment during a work accident in which his tractor crashes into a tree, upturns, and explodes into flame. Parker is thrown up into the air and crashes to the ground, possessed by yet another irresistible urge to get a tattoo. He leaves behind him the burning tractor, gets into his truck, and drives off to the tattoo shop. "Let me see the book you got with all the pictures of God in it," Parker said breathlessly, "the religious one." "Oh," said the artist, "who are you interested in? Saints, angels, Christ, or what?" "God," Parker said. "Father, Son, or Spirit?" "Just God," Parker said impatiently. "Christ, I don't care, just so it's God." The artist then gives him a book of Christ images, beginning with more modern images and advancing to more ancient ones. And I'll read you from the story. Parker sat down with the book and wet his thumb. He began to go through it, beginning at the back where the up-to-date pictures were. Some of them he recognized: the Good Shepherd, the smiling Jesus, Jesus the physician's friend. But he kept turning rapidly backwards, and the pictures became less and less reassuring. Parker's heart began to beat faster and faster until it appeared to be roaring inside him like a great generator. He flipped the pages quickly, feeling that when he reached the one ordained, a sign would come. He continued to flip through until he had almost reached the front of the book. On one of the pages, a pair of eyes glanced at him swiftly. Parker sped on, then stopped. His heart, too, appeared to cut off. There was absolute silence. It said, as plainly as if silence were a language itself, "Go back." Parker returned to the picture, the hallowed head of a flat, stern Byzantine Christ with all-demanding eyes. He sat there trembling, His heart began slowly to beat again, as if it were being brought to life by a subtle power. It's only after having the icon inscribed on his back, a process that took a couple of days, and then getting into a fight at a pool hall, that Parker experiences an inner conversion that leads him to experience for the first time an attraction of sorts to his wife. I read this, go back to the story. Parker sat for a long time on the ground in the alley behind the pool hall, examining his soul. He saw it as a spider web of facts and lies that was not at all important to him, but which appeared to be necessary in spite of his opinion. The eyes that were now forever on his back were eyes to be obeyed. He was as certain of it as he had ever been of anything. Throughout his life, grumbling and sometimes cursing, often afraid, once in rapture, Parker had obeyed whatever instinct of this kind had come to him. In rapture, when his spirit had lifted at the sight of the tattooed man at the fair, afraid when he had joined the Navy, grumbling when he had married Sarah Ruth. The thought of her brought him slowly to his feet. She would know what he had to do. She would clear up the rest of it, and she would at least be pleased. It seemed to him that all along that was what he wanted, to please her. With this inner reassurance, Parker rushes back to his wife, genuinely eager to see her for the first time in his life, and to show her his tattooed icon as a sign of their new communion in faith. But initially he has trouble getting Sarah Ruth to even look at it. Here's my final quotation from the story. "Another picture," Sarah Ruth growled. "I might have known you was off after putting some more trash on yourself." Parker's knees went hollow under him. He wheeled around and cried, "Look at it. Don't just say that. Look at it." "I done looked," she said. "Don't you know who it is?" he cried in anguish. "No, who is it?" Sarah Ruth said. "It ain't anybody I know." "It's him," Parker said. "Him who?" "God," Parker cried. "God? God don't look like that." "What do you know how he looks?" Parker moaned. "You ain't seen him." "He don't look," Sarah Ruth said. "He's a spirit. No man shall see his face." "Oh, listen," Parker groaned. "This is just a picture of him." "Idolatry!" Sarah Ruth screamed. "Idolatry, inflaming yourself with idols under every green tree. I can put up with lies and vanity, but I don't want no idolater in this house." And she grabbed up the broom and began to thrash him across the shoulders with it. Parker was too stunned to resist. He sat there and let her beat him until she had nearly knocked him senseless, and large welts had formed on the face of the tattooed Christ. Then he staggered up and made for the door. She stamped the broom 2 or 3 times on the floor and went to the window and shook it out to get the taint of him off it. Still gripping it, she looked toward the pecan tree, and her eyes hardened still more. There he was, who called himself Obadiah Elihu, leaning against the tree, crying like a baby. And so the story ends. There are complex and interlocking patterns of pathos in this story. But what concerns us most for now is that of the tragic tension between Parker's desire to animate his body with images, a desire that leads him finally to inscribe the image of God on his own body, and Sarah Ruth's violent rejection of this attempt as an idolatrous violation of God's spiritual dignity. I'm pretty sure that everyone here is inclined to be sympathetic toward Parker rather than Sarah Ruth. And the story itself is designed to motivate our sympathies in Parker's direction. But I think it's important not to dismiss without due consideration Sarah Ruth's point of view. The fear and shock and outrage at the notion that we can presume to see the divine, to make pictures of God. In fact, I want to suggest that to the extent that we are not aware of the shock and scandal of the presumption to see God and make pictures of God, we're actually losing out on the mysterious contents of this event of icons. The danger for us, I believe, is not iconoclasm, the rejection of icons, but rather that we tend to domesticate the whole experience, to steer it toward the merely subjective and aesthetic, so that praying with icons is not much different from having nice music in the background or adding on a little yoga to your prayers. So just to be provocative, let me say that in a certain sense, a kind of iconoclasm is really a positive and perhaps primary ingredient in the Christian experience of icons. The basic principle here is that God cannot be seen. We cannot contain God with even our minds, much less our faculties of sight. In the Old Testament, as Sarah Ruth knows, we have express prohibitions of images of the divine. You shall not make for yourself a graven image. Or God says, you cannot see my face. No one can see my face and live. In the New Testament, we're told that no one has ever seen God. In the Byzantine Divine Liturgy, we say that God is beyond description, beyond understanding, invisible, incomprehensible. None of this, in fact, is simply canceled out by the Incarnation. The New Testament, of course, in the Byzantine liturgy presuppose the Incarnation. So there's a fundamental principle here that cannot merely be negated or left behind. Our relationship to God goes beyond seeing. Point in Sarah Ruth's favor. But I've entitled this talk Beyond Seeing and Not Seeing, as a way of evoking what I believe to be the central paradox in the Christian experience of icons. If on the one hand, our relationship to God must always transcend seeing, on the other hand, it also transcends not seeing. And if the Judeo-Christian tradition rejects the claim to see God, it also rejects the notion that we simply do not see God. Even in the Old Testament, alongside the prohibition of images, we have accounts of the presence of God rendered visible. God leads the people of Israel out of Egypt under the visible signs of a cloud by day and fire by night. And the prophets are given visions of the heavenly throne. Jesus is called the icon of the image of the invisible God, icon, which is usually translated in English as the image of the invisible God, say in Colossians 1:15. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." And yet, to swing once more to the other side of the pendulum, it is curious to consider this statement attributed to Jesus, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," alongside the fact that there's not a single trace in the entire New Testament of a physical description of Jesus. That's odd. Why weren't they interested in what he looked like? Contrast that, for example, with lots of descriptions that we have of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, that he has, as you'd expect, tall, bulky shoulders and chest, light skin, brown hair, dark beard, and so on. But no descriptions like that of Jesus, even though Jesus says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." What do we make of this paradox, then, this double negation of both seeing God and not seeing God? And how is this paradox applicable to the role of icons in Christian experience? I think a good modern clarification of the meaning of this paradox is found in the work of the French Catholic philosopher Jean-Luc Marion. Marion, incidentally, once said that the Second Council of Nicaea, which I'll get to in a minute, which legitimated the use of icons, has resources to save modern art. Marion speaks of two ways of encountering the divine, and he associates one way with idolatry and the other way with the icon. The idol, he says, is a visible artifact that claims to fulfill the gaze as it aspires to encounter the divine. It stops your looking. It claims to fulfill your looking. The icon, however, both orients the gaze and summons it to advance beyond the visible representation toward an invisible, uncontainable presence. He says, "The gaze can never rest or settle if it looks at an icon. It always must rebound upon the invisible in order to go back in it up the infinite stream of the invisible. In this sense, the icon makes visible only by giving rise to an infinite gaze." Marion's distinction helps us to see how the icon animates an experience that is both beyond seeing and beyond not seeing. The icon draws the human senses, imagination, and intellect toward God through the paths of divine revelation, but they're also summoned to rise above all visible representation into the uncontainable and invisible presence of the living God. For the remainder of this talk, then, I want to do three things. First, I want to give a brief account of the foundational historical event that clarified the meaning of icons in the Christian tradition, the iconoclastic controversy which led to the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which was the last of the seven ecumenical councils of the undivided church. Secondly, I want to outline in quite general terms some of the main features of the tradition of Byzantine iconography. And thirdly, I want to invite you to join with me in reflecting on a few icons, and then hopefully that can lead us into a general discussion of people's experience of praying with icons. So first, a few comments on the iconoclastic controversy in the Second Council of Nicaea. The earliest Christian art, as found in the catacombs, for example, tended to be symbolic rather than representational, having for its subject matter concepts and symbols pertaining especially to the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, for example, a lamb or an ark. From these beginnings, there eventually developed a more representationalist art form, which by the 4th century included more widespread use of icons in churches and public places. In 451, the Council of Chalcedon defined that Jesus Christ is one person who owns both a divine and a human nature, without change, without division, without separation. This Christological dogma, with its affirmation of the integral humanity of Jesus, seems to have stimulated interest in icons representing Jesus and the Christian saints. It should be said that along with this growing interest came abuses, such as that implied by the complaint of a 7th century monk, St. Anastasius of Sinai, that some people were too busy kissing icons and not paying attention to the divine liturgy. The 7th century also saw the beginning and rapid growth of Islam, which adhered to a strict ban on images. The abuse of icons, perhaps coupled with a defensiveness with regard to Islam's ban on images, led to a reaction that advocated a return to the immaterial worship in spirit and truth. This reaction became a matter of imperial policy under Emperor Leo III, who reigned between 717 and 741, and who considered it to be his vocation to rid the churches of the idolatry of the veneration of icons. The campaign against icons, comprised of imperial decrees forbidding their veneration and the purging of the episcopacy from supporters of icons, was passed on from one emperor to the other until the reign of the Empress Irene, from 780 to 802, who practiced the veneration of icons herself. With this change of the political tide, the Second Council of Nicaea was convoked in 787. Now, a previous council, conducted by iconoclastic bishops, anti-icon bishops, had forbidden icons on Christological grounds. The argument against icons, the Christological argument against icons, was that a proper understanding of the union, the hypostatic union of humanity and Jesus and divinity in Jesus, indicates that the humanity is not separable from the divinity. If that's the case, said the anti-icon bishops, An image of Jesus must either purport to depict the humanity separately from the divinity. Are you just showing the humanity then? There's just humanity that's not united to the divinity? Or are you trying to show the divinity itself, which is impermissible? The Council of Nicaea, the Second Council of Nicaea, however, rejected that argument and reaffirmed the legitimacy of icon veneration on the basis of the referentiality of the material image to its prototype. The material image leads to the prototype. And this was the declaration then. Just as the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, so also the venerable and holy images should be set forth in the holy churches of God. The figure of our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our spotless Lady, the Mother of God, of the honorable angels, of all the saints, and of all pious people. For by so much more frequently as they are seen in artistic representation, by so much more readily are people lifted up to the memory of their prototypes, this infinite gaze drawing beyond the visible, and to a longing after them. And to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence, not indeed that true worship of faith which pertains only to the divine nature. For the honor which is paid to the image passes on to that which the image represents. That's really what Marion was trying to say. And he who reveres the image reveres in it the subject represented. Now, it's commonly proposed that this conciliar legitimation of icons is based directly and simply on the logic of the incarnation. That since the Word became flesh, his flesh can be depicted in visible form, and a fortiori, so can the bodily images of pious human beings. And this style of argument is indeed significant in the argument for icons. However, as I just pointed out, anti-icon bishops, iconoclastic bishops, also had a Christological argument, right, about the inseparability of the humanity and divinity. You can't just depict the humanity. The humanity is not separable from the divinity, and so you're either claiming that it's separable or else you're trying to depict the divinity directly. However, Nicaea II's response to that argument echoes a more nuanced and sophisticated Christological argument propounded by the most profound theological defender of icons, St. John of Damascus, who lived between 675 and 749. While echoing the simple argument from the Incarnation, John goes further in seeing the Incarnation as a climactic manifestation of the symbolic nature of all reality. And that's really the point of the theology of the icon, the symbolic nature of all reality. For John of Damascus, iconography really begins with the divine Trinitarian being, with the Trinity, in which the Son is the icon of the Father, just as in Colossians, the image of the invisible God, and the Greek word for image is ikon. The Son is the icon of the Father. And the Holy Spirit, says John of Damascus, is also the image of the Son. In turn, humanity was created in the image of God, while all material reality in some way images divine thought and will. All of nature are all natural things, all things in creation are icons, as it were, of divine thoughts. John of Damascus finally insists that the rejection of images would entail the deconstruction of worship in general, since human worship can never entirely abstract from material media. If we interpret the pronouncement of the Second Council of Nicaea in light of the theology of John of Damascus, we see that the veneration of icons was really the centerpiece, as I said, of a comprehensive symbolic theology. This symbolic vision extends from Trinitarian theology, the Son as image of the Father, to anthropology, humanity as the created image of the uncreated image of the Son, to cosmology, all matter images, divine ideas. Even more, it seems to me that a full theological account of the experience of icons in the Eastern tradition has to put primary stress on the conception of the human person as priest of creation. It's an important theme in Eastern theology. As priest of creation, the human person is ordained to offer creation back to God. Not in a passive way, but by actively manifesting creation's transparency to the divine presence. With regard to icons, this priestly work is accomplished both by the iconographer and the one who is praying with icons. In this context, we should note the emphasis that the material ingredients of the icon encompass different realms of creaturely reality. The vegetable world represented by the wood, the animal world in the glue and the egg that's used in making the icons, the mineral world in the chalk and color dyes, and so on. The iconographer synthesizes these different dimensions of material existence into an image that is transparent to the divine presence, and thus accomplishes the priestly task of actively rendering the cosmos transparent to the divine presence and offering it back to God in thanksgiving and praise. The one who prays with icons simply ratifies and continues this offering. Although the theme of the human person as priest of creation is very prominent in Eastern theology, it's not typically associated with the practice of icons in theological reflection, but I think experientially that is the content of the Eastern practice of praying with icons. And that is why there's a kind of sacramental seriousness to the Eastern practice of praying with icons that goes far beyond conceiving the icon as merely a visual aid to prayer. The key experience is that of offering. It's the priestly dimension that gives the experience a sacramental ambiance. The one who prays with the icon, gathering up all of the material creation and offering it and affirming its transparency to the divine presence and offering it back to God with thanksgiving and praise. I move now to the second part of my talk, the distinctive features of Byzantine icons. The name of icons is generally used not to refer universally to all Christian religious art, but particularly to that of the Eastern tradition. Even in the East, however, there are various traditions that vary considerably in the content and style of the religious art and the way it's situated within the life of worship. Today I'm concerned specifically with icons in the Byzantine tradition, which is the tradition that I belong to and know best, but which I think is fair to say is also the most developed in terms of its self-conscious estimation of the role of icons in the Christian life. By the Byzantine tradition, I mean those churches that are historically derivative of the Greek Church of Constantinople and whose customary Eucharistic liturgy is that of St. John Chrysostom. That would include principally the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches and their Catholic counterparts, the Melkite Church, for example. A basic literacy with respect to Byzantine icons requires an appreciation, I think, of at least four basic features of that tradition. First, Byzantine icons strive for a middle point between realistic representationalism and abstraction. Now, rather than attempt formal definitions, we can just see the difference. So this is a self-portrait of Rembrandt, the great Dutch painter of the 17th century. So the style there is representational. There's an attempt simply to depict what he looks like in real life, okay, to represent real life. So there's the realism. And that is Rembrandt's portrait of Jesus. Again, it's fairly realistic. On the other hand, a more abstract style comes from the Coptic tradition, the Egyptian tradition. And here you see there's definitely no attempt for realistic representation. The image is geometric and angular. Okay? Jesus obviously didn't look like that in real life. So as I said, the self-definition of Byzantine iconography is typically articulated over against both representation and abstraction. And there's a theological points that are relevant to both, to the rejection of both what are considered extremes from the Byzantine point of view. On the one hand, the theology of Byzantine icons sees realistic representation as a capitulation to the fallen world. Things as they really are fallen. And so the icon doesn't aim to represent statically the way things are in this fallen world. In simply mirroring nature, the artist is thereby consenting to being imprisoned in the fallen state of nature. On the other hand, abstraction amounts to a denial and rejection of nature. So over against both representation and abstraction, Byzantine iconography aims for a prophetic depiction of a transfigured cosmos and a transfigured humanity. Not nature as it happens to be now, not simply abstracting from nature, but a prophetic vision of nature transfigured by graced interaction with God. And so a modern Byzantine theologian says, a saint is thus represented not according to the appearance of his corruptible flesh, but according to that of the glorified body of Christ. So this goal of invoking a transfigured creation determines the Byzantine style. The depiction must not be a mirror image of the natural prototype, but a glorified image. At the same time, it must still maintain a concrete and organic, recognizable link with the original image, and so cannot be too abstract, as we see with the geometric figures of Coptic art. So that's the first feature, then stylistic, definitional feature of Byzantine iconography, this middle way between representation and abstraction. The second feature derives from the first, and this is going to sound complicated, but we'll figure it out very quickly. Techniques of constructing the illusion of the visible world are shunned in favor of a style that insists on the primacy of the surface of the icon itself. I told you it sounded complicated. Okay, so take the first part of it. Techniques of constructing the illusion of the visible world are shunned. Well, primarily two techniques that developed in Western art, especially with the Renaissance. First of all, developments in the depiction of perspective, the great revolution in perspective, which creates the illusion of three-dimensional space. So you have a picture from Fra Angelico, and you see he's showing off here his mastery of perspective, right? So you've got the ray of light in between the pillars. So you have a sense of depth, right? The illusion of depth. So the real two-dimensional surface of the painting is supplanted by the three-dimensional reality that is being depicted. The second technique is the play of light and shadow, or light and darkness, chiaroscuro. And here you have a hint of that. You know, this is very lighted up in the front, and this is a lot darker in the back. You have more extreme uses of that technique. By contrast, look at the Byzantine icon of the Nativity, where everything is superimposed in a fairly egalitarian way over the surface of the icon, in a style that is unabashedly two-dimensional. There's no effort to disguise that fact or to simulate the illusion of three-dimensional space. Everything is happening at once. The angels, the wise men, the shepherd. We'll talk some more about this in a minute. But everything is on the same level. There's no attempt at three-dimensional illusion. Now, why is that? What's the sort of the worldview, the ambiance behind this rejection of perspective? Well, the point is that the icon is not supposed to lead you back into the real world. The space that the icon is concerned with is not the space of visible reality and nature, again, as it stands in its fallen state behind the icon. Rather, the icon purports to subsume the depicted space into itself, to bring the space of the visible world into its own space and project it toward the person viewing the icon and praying with it. Sometimes that's called reverse perspective. Okay, rather than depth inwards, it's sort of a projection outwards. So that the destination of the projection is not behind the icon, but in front of the icon toward the person praying with it. So the icon in that sense is an extroverted medium. It turns outward. It sort of pushes the contents outward. And so in that way, the event being portrayed in the icon is projected outward so as to be an event within the one praying with the icon. So to go back to the story, Parker's literally taking the icon onto his own body is really the perfect dramatization of the intended effect of the icon. And here again, I want to illustrate by quotation from Vladimir Lossky, who was a modern Orthodox theologian who's written about this. He says, if a painting composed in compliance with the laws of linear perspective represents another space that has no relationship with the real space where it's located, in the icon, the represented space is included in the real space. You're not supposed to forget the surface and go back behind it. He continues, as the space represented in the icon is united to the real space in front of it, so the depicted event which took place in a time past is united to the present moment. And that's the essential issue, I think. As I said, that the icon points forwards and not backwards. The time and space that the icon is concerned with is the time and space of the icon itself, as a kind of sacramental space and time, not some natural time and space that the icon adverts to. The third feature that I want to mention briefly is the personalism or humanism of the icon. That the center of the icon is always a human image. There are no icons, you have those inspiring religious pictures of hills and sunset and woods and things like that. And that's not an icon. You definitely need a human image right in the middle somehow. And again, quoting from a 20th century iconographer, Gregory the Monk, he says, only an image that has a face looking at us and a human face transfigured by divine grace has the right to be called an icon. So the icon then is anthropocentric. There always has to be a human figure at the center of it. And that again is linked to the theme of the human being as priest of creation. And also to the theme in Orthodox and Eastern theology of the destiny of nature to be hypostasized or personalized through human intervention, through the human priestly vocation. That nature attains its destiny when it's oriented to the human being, who in turn offers it to God in thanksgiving and praise. And fourth, and the last feature that I'll mention, in Byzantine iconography, there's a strong yet not rigidly defined sense of canon and continuity of tradition. And that's a typically Eastern combination. That on the one hand, you have a strong impetus toward continuity. On the other hand, the terms of that continuity are left undefined in a way that allows for some flexibility and creative development. So you have An illustration of this kind of synthesis in the Council of the 100 Chapters in Moscow in 1551, which stipulated simply that the iconographer follow the example of the ancient writers. So on the one hand, the continuity is prescribed, do it the way it's been done. On the other hand, follow the example is a pretty loose injunction that leaves some considerable wiggle room, how you follow that example. Expressed in a modern idiom by a fairly traditionalist Orthodox theologian, he says, not only can the icon be new, it must be new, but the new icon must express the same truth. This dialectic of change within continuity. Well, definitely with a strong impetus on manifesting the continuity. You can't just sort of make things up and depict Jesus in a completely different way, and so on. So these then are four important features of the self-definition of Byzantine icons. One, that it's between representation and abstraction. Two, reverse perspective, or the extraversion of the icon, pointing outwards, not inwards, and so shunning illusions of perspective and so on. Third, it's personalism or anthropocentrism, the theme of the human being as priest of creation and the personalization of nature through humanity. And fourth, a strong but not rigid sense of tradition. To the extent that one is conscious of these features, I think one enters more deeply into the experience they're meant to invoke. Come to my final part of the talk, praying with icons. So for the final part of my presentation tonight, I'd just like to briefly share with you, somewhat informally, three of my favorite icons, along with a few remarks about my experience of praying with these, and maybe that could lead to some more sharing on your part. So first, that's the icon I usually pray with. It's called Christ the Teacher. It comes from a 5th century monastery in Sinai. Here you see, again, the primacy of the face and the authority of Jesus. You remember Parker talking about eyes to be obeyed, and yet tempered with gentleness. A Roman Catholic theologian, von Balthasar, talks about the authority of Jesus as that of one who sees through to the inmost state of things. Jesus sees through the ultimate meaning of the law and the ultimate stance of the person he's dealing with. I mentioned Marion talks about the icon as summoning the gaze past the image. I think as much as that's valuable to distinguish an icon from an idol, I think actually what happens in an icon is even more than that. The icon doesn't, it seems to me, just summon the gaze past the image. In a way, it reverts the gaze. In the Byzantine icons of Jesus, not so much that you look at Jesus, or even that you look past the image to a greater invisible reality. Rather, Jesus looks not just at you, but through you. And see, contrast that. Contrast sort of the absolute authority of Jesus' gaze, the way you're immediately sort of become subject to that gaze. You can't stare him down. He's always, looking at you, looking through you. And compare that with going back to Rembrandt's Jesus. So Rembrandt's Jesus, you're eavesdropping on his introspection, right? So he's having a contemplative moment, he's wondering, he's thinking, he's looking the other way, he's looking inside and so on, and you're sort of eavesdropping, sort of looking in on that. That never happens in Byzantine icons. There's no eavesdropping on Jesus. He's always looking at you, looking through you. I also like praying with this icon because Jesus is holding the scriptures, and that's a common depiction of Jesus, Christ the teacher. And I think in a way that Jesus holding the scriptures relativizes the physical image, as if to say, as if the icon is telling you, the representation is telling you, that the image of Jesus is not so much in a physical depiction of a face, even in this stylized, glorified image, but in the fullness of the Scriptures, which I find very conducive to prayer. You know, Jesus presenting himself with the Scriptures, Jesus presenting himself in the Scriptures, through the Scriptures. And then some basic stylistic features. You have the gold aura representing divinity, and then the standard blessing of Jesus with 2 fingers representing the divine, the unity of the divine and human natures, and then the thumb and 2 other fingers representing the Trinity. And then as we wind our way toward Christmas, as the shopping malls already know, how did that happen? So here, again, you see the lack of perspective. Angels, shepherds, everything is happening at the same time. There's a simultaneity of events in space and time, and all is concentrated as sacramental here and now. Now, typically at the center of an icon, there's a human face and eyes, and if not, there's a dramatic action, like the resurrection or here the birth of Jesus. And here you have a very dramatic effect by having the center occupied by the tiny figure of the baby Jesus, whose tininess is accentuated by the elongated figure of Mary, expressing the paradox of the God who became small, as St. Ephrem says, which is the same mystery expressed in the Byzantine liturgy in the Kontakion, the hymn for the Nativity. Today the Virgin gives birth to the Transcendent One, and the earth offers a cave to the Unapproachable One. Angels with shepherds glorify him, the wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the eternal God was born as a little child. And the icon attempts to represent all of that, and just like the Kontakion says, today, not let me take you back to that historical context, but today all this happens. The icon also, with this simultaneity of time and space, tells you all of this is happening now, right here in the icon, as you pray with it. And finally, something that I appreciate a lot over against the usual banalization of Christmas as the feast of suburban family values, is the chaos, the perplexity, the melancholy of the net effect, and especially the poignant interaction of Joseph and Mary. So you see Joseph here, and Joseph, what's happening is Joseph is turned away from Mary, and he's being tempted by the devil, who is suggesting to him that Mary has betrayed him and slept with another man. And Mary, again, is looking away from the baby Jesus and toward Joseph with sympathy, compassion, maybe hurt feelings. And so there's this melancholy drama in the middle of the event of the Nativity of Jesus. And yet, you know, there's an atmosphere of openness that suffuses everything. So that, you know, the openness of the angels, the wise men, the shepherd. But even, you know, Joseph is being tempted, but he's looking away from the devil, and he is, you know, wondering. There's a hope in his gaze. You know, I don't understand what's going on, but maybe this is going to be okay somehow. And you know, and the openness of Mary, you know, toward Joseph and his sorrow and so on. So it's a wonderfully, you know, dramatic portrayal of just so many of the poignant elements in the Nativity story, all brought together. Okay, so the final icon I want to talk briefly about is, most of you know this, the depiction of, usually known as Rublev's Trinity, from the iconographer Andrei Rublev, who lived in early 15th century. It was very highly esteemed in the Byzantine tradition. I'll read you the short hymn sung on his feast day, July 4th, in the Byzantine liturgy. Shining with the rays of divine light, O venerable Andrew, you knew Christ, the wisdom and power of God, by means of the image of the Holy Trinity. You preach to all the world the Holy Trinity in unity, and we with amazement and joy cry out to you. As you have boldness before the most Holy Trinity, pray that the uncreated light may illumine our souls. So now, even though icon is usually referred to as Rublev's Trinity, of course, this is not the Trinity. It's not meant to depict Father, Son, and Holy Spirit directly, but rather to depict the story in Genesis 18, 1-8, in which three men come to visit Abraham, and he prepares a meal for them and serves them, and they promise him that Sarah will bear a child in her old age. Notice again, there's no center of gaze. There's not a central figure looking at you. Rather, the point here is that each of the figures is turned towards the other. So there's a circularity of seeing, symbolizing the circular mutual indwelling of the Trinitarian persons, where each of the persons is oriented toward the other in a fullness of communion. And then notice also that they're seated around a table where there's a sacrifice. In the scriptural story, the promise to Abraham will be fulfilled. Sarah will bear Isaac, but Abraham will be tested by the call to give up his only son as a sacrifice to God. In patristic exegesis, this testing of Abraham was taken to be a foreshadowing of the Trinitarian sacrifice, whereby the Father would give up his only begotten Son to be incarnate and crucified for the life of the world. So the biblical story of hospitality, promise, and sacrifice is taken as a parable of Trinitarian life. So once again, we see the crucial interplay of icon and scripture. Here the icon is really doing scriptural exegesis. Even more, I think, with the image of the cup on the table, it's invoking the reality of the Eucharist. Notice that the chalice is pushed out beyond the center of the table, sort of towards the viewer, as if to invite you to the Eucharistic table. And so apart from its symbolization of Trinitarian life, this icon for me is exemplary in the way it situates the place of the icon itself in direct relation to Scripture as its source and Eucharistic communion as its goal. Okay, by way of conclusion now, let me summarize a few of my main points. The Byzantine experience of icons is oriented toward going both beyond the claim to see the divine nature and the banishing of God from all visible and sensory experience, beyond seeing and not seeing. Jean-Luc Marion helped us to see that whereas an idol brings the gaze to a stop, the icon summons the gaze beyond the visible representation toward an invisible presence. But I suggested that even beyond that, the icon not only summons the gaze to transcend the depicted image, but even reverses the gaze, so that the one who is praying with the icon has more the experience of being seen than seeing. The Byzantine icon in particular does not attempt to draw the viewer into a projected historical time and space, but rather subsumes the depicted time and space into itself and projects it outward toward the person praying with the icon. This makes the experience of praying with an icon a sacramental event in which the person praying assumes the priestly role of affirming creation's transparency to the divine presence in an offering of prayer and thanksgiving and glory. The icon becomes the center of a transaction between divine self-revelation in the realm of the visible and the human being's reception of that revelation into her very being. We can say that, like the Eucharist itself, the ultimate destination of the icon is to be inscribed into the very bodiliness of the one who prays with the icon, in a way that is very dramatically and literally represented, as I said, by the story of Obadiah Ilahu, who tattoos the icon of Christ on his skin. The icon then plays an essential role in leading the human being back into the fullness of being in the image and likeness of God. Thank you.